Hello and welcome to the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial here today on YouTube, I want to share an easy techniques only sunlight capture. I've got an example made up in red and black. Easy techniques only, I promise. And we're going to work together in blue crystals from my stash o' crystals to create a beautiful copper sun catcher. Now, dependent on what beads you use, these can be left outside. So if you're using all crystals or a metal that you don't mind tarnishing, they will be absolutely fine in the weather as it happens outside. If you're using beads that use glue perhaps to hold in small rhinestones, they are suitable for inside use only. Let's have a look at the piece that I've made ready to demonstrate with today, a little bit closer on the board. So here's a quick example that I made up just a few minutes ago to show you what kind of thing we're going to make together today. I'm working in raw copper as ever, not only because it's beautiful to work with, but because when this starts to age outside in the atmosphere, it will darken beautifully. It self-patinas. So I really like working with raw copper, plus it's really soft and malleable. Today's techniques are all entry level, easy beginner projects, and we don't need a huge amount of tools, and we can always improvise if we need to. In terms of making the main shape, it's a little bit like an ammonite. For my piece that I'm going to work up with you on the board today, I'm going to work with a super heavy wire. This is 1.6 millimeter gauge, which is approximately equivalent to 14 gauge wire. I'm working with just over 12 inches, and we're going to get cracking up at the top of the design. Now, as with all of my wire work designs, I want to warm that wire through. It takes a little bit more effort with such a heavy gauge wire, but what we want to do is to ensure it's straight. There are no major kinks. There's a little bit of a ridge at the top here, so I'm just going to use the pliers to straighten that up and get that nice and warm and as smooth as I possibly can. Now, it's a very simple design. I wanted to bring something that was absolutely beginner friendly, so we're going to start off with some round nose pliers, and I'm going to create a really open coil up at the top. So whereas normally I would grab the very end of the wire with the very end of my pliers, I'm going to take it much further up towards the box joint on those pliers and start rotating that around. Now, if you're eagle-eyed, you'll have noticed that I didn't trim the end of this wire properly to begin with. So before I get stuck in, I'm just going to take that sharp end off. You can see how much effort one has to put into using those flush cutters to get that to move. So now we've got a nice flush end back into those round nose pliers, and I'm going to rotate them around until I get the first circular form. So we're working towards having a nice open centre, and then you can either gradually bring the wire out slightly or do a couple of circuits closed up. You may need to adjust how you grip your wire to get the heavier gauge to work. The piece that I made up earlier before the video today, I've just created this in 1mm or 18 gauge, just as a quick demonstration piece. This wouldn't survive very long, as it is indeed too light. Now, because I'm going to be hanging this, I'm going to be using a heavier wire. The piece that I just showed you is just to show you an idea of what we're going to work towards. And I'll put them side by side at the end of the tutorial. So I'm going for 3 circuits. So we started here, we've gone around 3 times, and I've kept those relatively closed up. What I will do at the end is find something to hang this from. So I've got a small piece of black ribbon just looped through on the demonstration piece. You could use a piece of hessian or gardener's twine if you wanted to hang this outside. The next thing we're going to do is to change the direction of the wire. So we've got the wire coming round like so. Now I want it to skirt in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to put a little bit of warmth into this to begin with. You can see that the wire is ready to start bending around in that direction, even though it's a good heavy wire. Now, at this juncture, it will absolutely pay you to be using a mandrel. I've got this bangle mandrel that I've had since approximately the dawn of time, and I'm going to use the largest possible position on here. It's just slightly smaller than that of a baked bean tin. So if you wanted to recreate that without any specialist tools at all, you can simply use something that is very solid and round. Now, we don't add any detail to the open end until we've loaded all of our component parts on. So in addition to the main frame itself, I'm going to show you a handful of very easy and beginner accessible techniques that you can use to create things to put on your sunlight catcher. Also, we're going to finish off with a lovely bit of flourish work over on one side, just to add a little bit of detail. Now, if you are going to hang this out in the weather, that's going to be beautiful as it begins to patina or naturally age and darken if you're using a raw copper like me. So let's have a look at some of the techniques we're going to learn together. The first technique I want to share with you is how to create a tiny little coiled spacer. Easiest technique going. You can use round pliers to generate this design, but the easiest way is to use a thin piece of metal. Now, your bail making pliers are perfect for this because the distance on the top here, which is number 2 on the bail making scale, it's the same size all the way along from the tip to the step. These are stepped bail making pliers, super useful. So what I'm going to do is use the other side of my bail makers to grip the end of that wire and start rotating around with the open end of the wire in this direction. So if I flip those pliers over now, you can see what will happen is I'm trying to create a coil. This is a little bit like using a gizmo, but this is the cheats quick version. What I want to have are 5 passes of wire that are nice and super tight together. Now you might notice that I've done slightly more than 5 there. The reason that I've kept going, once I retract the pliers, you might be able to see that that first one is a little bit loose. So I'm working from the reel to try and minimise wastage as much as possible. I go through absolutely miles of this raw copper wire. So what I'm going to do is trim away using the flush side of my cutters, very carefully ensuring it's just on that first side, that first wrap rather. Let's get that coil of wire out of the way. And then I'm going to flip this over to the other side. Now what I want to see are 5 visible coils on the front there. This first one is the one that got away with me, from me rather. So I'm just going to chase that around until it starts behaving and is neatly nestled against its neighbour. Gosh, that was a bit of a tongue twister. Clip again using my flush side of those flush cutters, and what you will end up with is a small spacer. And you can see on the front there are 5 coils of wire. So I'm going to put that in a little pile with my other ones. I've prepared 3 already. In the design we're working together today, I'm going to use 4 of those. The next piece that I'm going to make is a simple charm drop. Now this is using beads that will fit on a 1mm or 18 gauge wire. So I've just chosen these 2 from my crystal bead stash, which is rather extensive. Now this will use around about 3 inches of 18 gauge 1mm wire. I've got 4 here to demonstrate with, and you'll see how much we cut off at the end, just because it's easier to show you when I'm not using the tiniest last little bit. So again, we're going to make sure that that first end is nice and flush. Make sure that you get that teeny bit in the bin where it can't hurt you. You can melt your raw copper down and use it for other things. And rather than the open spiral we made at the top of our frame, where we had a lovely opening in the centre, I'm going to use the very tip of my round nose pliers this time to generate a small closed up coil. It's not completely closed because you've got to start it somewhere. I'm going to then switch to my flat pliers or my bent chain nose pliers and go for 2 wraps around that central gap, like so. I'm quite happy with how flat that is. So what I want to do now is switch the grip, pop my chain nose pliers underneath, near to the point where that second coil of wire finishes. So we've gone around once, twice, and then I'm just going to turn that away. What I then need to do is straighten up the long tail of wire, just to make putting on beads as easy as possible. Now if you are working with crystals, you do need to be very careful about smashing them. So there's the first one. Let's add the second one of my chosen beads today. So it's a very, very simple charm drop. We're going to again be using 4 of this design, so I've already prepared 3. I'm going to put my pliers over the top, and when you're making these in terms of trying to repeat them, you just need to be aware of where the next bend occurs. I'm going to try and keep it the same each time, so that when these sit on the bar, they all hang at the same height. No major dramas if they don't, because this isn't jewellery. It's a sunlight catcher after all, and they're designed to just kind of be pretty. So then I'm going to pop in with those round nose pliers, rotate the wire around, get the first half of my shepherd's crook done, bring the tail over or under, whichever is easiest for you. So we've got that loop sitting at the end of the core wire. I'm going to show you the 2 plier technique now for finishing that wrapped loop neatly. So if you've normally done this with just 1 set of pliers, when you add that second pair of pliers in, or set of pliers, what you can do is get a really tidy finish. So I've got my 2 little wraps going around that core. What I need to do is trim away, and we are left with around about 1 inch. So you use about 3 inches of wire when you've just got 2 small beads to drop with here. That's what you would use. If you're going for a much longer drop, you'd need to increase the wire. So we used about 3 inches in the end, and I've wasted 1 inch there, but it's just easier to show you the technique. What I'm going to do now is use a second set of finely tapered pliers to just make sure that that last little bit sits down neatly on the core and it's not sticking out. Slightly less important with sunlight catchers than it is with jewellery, but it does pay to just take a moment to get things as neat as you can. I hope you'll agree that this is completely beginner accessible. Those first couple of techniques that we've learnt together don't take a huge amount of tools or experience. We're going to move on now to a central dropper, just in case you've got a bead that is drilled slightly differently. I'm going to use one that is drilled front to back at the very top of a pear drop. So if you'd like to join me back down on the board, we'll take a look at that now. So my beautifully faceted, this is in fact a Swarovski element in a blue treated crystal glass. Very, very pretty, lovely facet work, and the angles that have been put into the sides is really delightful. So I think it will work very well in my sunlight catcher. You do need to check that your wire will fit through the drill hole. So again, I'm using a scrap this time of 1mm or 18 gauge. Now when you're working with a crystal like this, what we don't want to do is put too much pressure or stress on the drill hole. So what we're going to do is start with a small wrapped loop up at the top and work from there. So when I'm making a small wrapped loop, I'm going to come about 3/4 of an inch from one end, and this piece of wire is probably 2.5 inches in length. It's about the smallest it needs to be. I'm going to repeat what we did for the earlier charms and just create shepherd's hook, draw the wire around, and then we can quite quickly finish this as a wrapped loop. Quite nice sometimes to do this without a bead in place, because you can see a little bit more easily, if you've never done a wrapped loop, how that all comes together. If you're more experienced wire worker, you've probably done enough wrapped loops to not be overly worried about this. The reason I'm doing the wrapped loop first on this design is to cause the least amount of pressure on the drill hole if you're working with a slightly more fragile shaped or material bead. So just making sure that that's all nice and flat and it sits centrally, and I'm super happy with that. What we're going to do now is to create a very large openable loop. Now there's not a huge amount of downward weight or pressure. Gravity won't have a massive impact on this bead. What we do want is to get now a nice circular form that is very large. If you make the circular form here too small, then it will put too much pressure as it travels through the front of the bead, comes back out the back side, there's not enough space for it to move in there without shattering the bead. So the first part of this is to orient your the gap at the top in the correct direction. So what we're looking to do is to bring the wire forwards at 90 degrees to what's essentially the bail, but the loop up at the top. This is the neat side of the wrap. You'll often have a second side where you can see the cut end. We don't want to see that going forwards, we want that to be on the back. So I've got now about a 45-degree angle here, and I'm going to grab again those bail making pliers and use the largest size I possibly can to just roll the wire around. Now, because we started with a relatively short length of wire, I know we're probably only going to need just over half, heading towards 2/3 of this wire. But what I will do is I will roll this around all the way from the end and just show you the kind of size that you would need to use. So there's not a huge amount of wire left remaining. What I'm going to do is trim that at the point that it crosses the first angle we made, using the flush side of my cutters and then getting rid of that tail of wire. At this juncture, before you go any further, you can just address any changes in angle that you need to make. So we would want the invisible line to come all the way through down in a straight line. What I'm also going to do is make sure that the very, very last section of wire sits snugly against that angle. And I'm then going to open and close to work harden that loop. This again is 1mm or 18 gauge wire. If you have a large hold bead, you don't have to worry overly about it, but because this is a beautiful bead, I was desperate to use it in this design, but it doesn't have a vast hole. It's only just over 1mm. So the idea is, when you pass the bead through a hole pass the wire through a bead in a hole that is oriented thusly, it's going to have some curvature inside the bead. Therefore you can't have much of a bend, because the distance from the front aperture to the rear aperture means that if you have a very small loop, you'll shatter that bead in no time. So we're going to open this exactly the same way as we would a jump ring. So that's to create a bend in the very centre and open it like so, rather than opening it like so. So let's see if this bead goes on smoothly and easily. So that actually feels really, really nice. I will show you briefly on a smaller version of what we've just made. This would be risky because you can probably see it doesn't really want to move around the curve of the wire quite so freely. And that's down to the size of the wire versus the size of the drill hole and the distance between the openings. So I'm going to take it back off that one and allow that now to slide into its final position. There we go. Very, very gently when you're working with a bead drilled in this formation. So once the bead is sighted, I'm just going to open and close the pliers on that round form, making sure I don't smash the bead that I've been so careful to avoid stressing. Now just quickly, if you want to, you can add another one of your beads into the neck after the wrapped loop and before you put the curvature at the base. Just an option, you don't have to do that, you can make it exactly how you want to. So let's have a look at that form we made and the other bits and bobs that we're going to use. So I made some spacers to go between the charms, the central piece, another spacer, another charm, spacer and a charm. Now you can use whatever charms and drops and beads, you could even use ready-made spacer beads. I just wanted to show you a selection of techniques today. So we're going to load all of those on in the order that we've decided, making sure that you've picked what you want to be the front, and that is always going to be oriented the neatest sections of your work. When you're making wrapped loops, there will always be one side which is just marginally less gorgeous than the one you want to look at. So there's nothing wrong with it, it's just not quite as beautiful. And if you have the opportunity to make sure that they're oriented correctly, do take it. Of course, these little spacers that I've made, they will spin around anyway, so it's not the end of the world if it doesn't all go exactly how you want it to. So we've added our cluster of dangly sections. Let me just grab that stunt segment as well. So I just quickly made this before I started recording the video to give you an idea of what we were looking to work towards. This is just made in 1mm 18 gauge, so it won't stay. I'll take it apart and put it on some heavier wire later. Once we've loaded all of these sections onto the wire, and I've not been able to put many beads directly on here because it's such a heavy gauge. I want this to last for a long time once it's hanging up outside, so it needs to be a good solid wire. So the next thing we're going to do is start curling this end around. Now you can very simply recreate the hanging loop up at the top, bringing the wire inwards, but I like to play around with the design and make this one a slightly more open shape. As we start, you might need to just open that the same way again as you would a jump ring, so you have a decent access point to start that form off. Now again, I will say this is the heaviest wire that I've been working with today. This is 1.6mm, which is equivalent to 14 gauge. So I've started my first loop before changing back out to my flat facing pliers, and this time, instead of having those 3 circuits of wire tight against each other, I'm going to have a little bit of a gap. Now I like to graduate the gap out so that it grows slightly as you move along, and you can make small alterations. You can keep it exactly the same distance apart on each pass of wire if you like, or you can just make that grow slightly if you need to. It's a very heavy wire, so take your time. If you're working with a heavy wire like I am, just take your time and start moving that around. Now, it doesn't matter how many coils you put together, you could even hang it just like that. What I thought I wanted to do was just change the dynamic between the upper coil and the open coil here, and have it form a little bit like an ammonite. So I'm going to manually do this without the pliers, just to start that coming in. If you struggle to do that, you can of course use your pliers to help you. So it could look a bit like a swan, I suppose. That's just the way I wanted it to hang. So let's pop that down on the board for a second. If you imagine that this is the centre of gravity, what I'm looking to do is to get these coils here immediately below where I want it to hang. So that should hang reasonably. Obviously I can't lift that up just now, but that should hang pretty centrally. Might need to just take that a tiny bit further. I'm reasonably happy with the hanging dynamic that I've got here. You of course can just move things over slightly if you wish to. For the last part of today's tutorial, what I'm going to do is show you how to make a nice little bit of swirly whirly wire that sits over the top and side. You can make it as short or as long as you want, or you don't have to have it at all. For the next section, I'm going to use some 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire, and I'm just going to unspool about 14 inches, trim that off the reel, and then I'm going to cut it in half. So I've got 2 7-inch lengths. This will make a nice short piece of swirly whirly wire just to demonstrate the technique. The first thing I want to do is to warm this wire slightly and to get those two to sit side by side. So again, that's 0.8mm 20 gauge round raw copper, and I have 2 approximately 7-inch lengths. I'm going to start working around about 1.5 inches from one end. I'm going to pinch very firmly with my non-dominant hand. And what I'm trying to do here is to keep the wires side by side. So although 2 tracks are crossing over and then going underneath, the side-by-side train track-like movement of the wire doesn't change all the way through. So if I just pull that slightly tighter, what you can do, if it's easier for you, is use a pair of flat-facing pliers to help you. So I'm just going to grip that very, very firmly and show you the loop. So it's like railway tracks. The 2 pieces of wire never cross over one another. They always stay side by side. So the next thing I'm going to do is change the direction of the wires. So I'm going to pinch again firmly, this time with my dominant hand, and draw that around. And what we're looking to do is to create a weird wiggly figure of 8 type manoeuvre. If you struggle with your pinch strength, You could use your pliers to just hold that and make very small movements, a little bit at a time. And to move that along slightly. And then bring the wire all the way over the top this time. I'm going to pinch the assembly strongly with my non-dominant hand now, wiggle the wire around a bit, and you'll see that that goes to where you want it to, which is we've done a loop up, switch around, done a loop underneath, and then it's coming down this time. So again, I'm going to pinch, switch the direction of the wire around, draw that all the way back around. Now you can see one of my wires has crossed under the other, so I'm just sorting that out before I go any further. And then I'm going to pinch, pinch, pinch and move that around. So they open up slightly in places, that's absolutely fine, it doesn't matter one bit, as long as the two wires stay side by side and don't cross over. So I'm going to do a couple more of those. You just watch as that grows along. So I've demonstrated with a short length. This is around about 14 inches in total, so 2 sets of 7 inches. I just wanted to give you an idea of the swirly whirly technique. What I want to do now is attach that to my frame. So I'm going to start the swirly whirly technique up at the top here. And what I'm going to do is make sure that those 2 finer gauge wires come up and away for the time being. I'm going to lay, let's just get that ribbon out of the way for a second. I'm going to lay the swirly whirly bit over that heavy frame, pinch it down on top, draw those 2 tail wires all the way round a couple of times until I've got a reasonably short tail. These are just under, it's about ½ an inch to be fair. What I want to do is make sure that that is super firmly attached onto my heavy frame. What I would then do is just form the swirly whirly section so that it follows the curvature of the top of your heavy frame. I'm then going to reorient things so that I'm at the far end. You can scooch your beads and bits out the way for a moment, pinching down again on top, bring those 2 wires so that they're passing over the surface, and then again we're going to draw those all the way around. You do need a bit of pinch strength here just to hold everything together. Now I've not quite got enough to go all the way around again, but that 1.5 times wrapping is enough to hold my swirly whirly section in place. And you can see I've just put a little bit of gentle curvature to follow the contour of our ammonite-like shape. So what I'm going to do with the very end sections is a little bit of light coiling. Now to make my life easier, I'm going to coil up and away to begin with, and then push that flat down over the surface. And it just blends in nicely with the whole technique. If you need to, this is a little bit loose, what you can do is use one of these end sections just to loop through and grab hold. The other option is just to tighten your wrapping until it stays put like a good piece of wire work, which is probably what I will do with this one. So you do exactly the same thing with the other piece. And then the same down at the bottom. Your coils can come away or they can come back on themselves, it doesn't matter. Once you've finished adding your swirly whirly section, you've then got the option, you can change the size of your piece if you like. You just need to be slightly aware of where you want that centre of balance or centre of gravity to sit in the design. I'm popping that down on the table now. And I think that we are pretty much done. Just put little coils on the end and job is a good one. So I hope you've enjoyed the sun catcher design. I know I have. I'm just going to finish off that blue themed one with my last couple of coils, and then I'll photograph it and leave it on the board for you to look at in just a couple of seconds. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I'm Jem Hawkes. It's been my pleasure to be with you here on YouTube. Have yourself a lovely day. See you soon. Bye for now.